One federal judge knows how real the threat of violence can be. Nearly 5 years ago, Judge Esther Salas's husband was shot and her son Daniel was killed by a disgruntled lawyer posing as a delivery driver at her home, according to police. Judge Salas from the U.S. District Court of New Jersey joins me now. Judge, welcome to the NewsHour, and thank you so much for making the time to join us.
Thank you for having me, Abna.
So since these incidents began, we should note that you have been meeting with the U.S. Marshals Service. You just met with them today, in fact. What can you tell us about that meeting and whether you think they're doing enough to keep you and other judges safe?
Well, I want to start with the last question, and that's yes. I think they are doing all that they can do to keep up with the onslaught of attacks against the judiciary. I did meet with representatives today. The meeting went well, and I can tell you that they have confirmed for me what I've known for some time, which is that there are over 100 pizzas that have been delivered to judges, children, and now recently.
What's happening? Guys, welcome back to Dr. John Podcast. Supreme Court delivers seismic rulings. Trump goes berserk on live TV, calls justices fools and lapdogs, threatens to ignore them. Impeachment papers fly. But here's the twist. The most consequential ruling, Trump versus United States, actually expanded his immunity. The protection grows even as the fury escalates. Let me emphasize that point because it's absolutely critical to understanding what's really happening with the Supreme Court and Trump's legal position. The specific judicial determination that most directly makes it harder to prosecute Trump for the most consequential categories of conduct, the conduct most urgently relevant to his most serious criminal exposure, is not some minor procedural ruling.
They're sending pizzas to judges, their children, and utilizing my murdered son's name. They're weaponizing my child's name to really impact fear on judges all throughout this country.
You're, of course, referencing the spate of recent anonymous pizza deliveries to judges that we've seen, as you mentioned, many of them using your late son's name. And we should tell folks, Congress passed a law in your late son's name that was supposed to help judges remove personal information from online, like home addresses and phone numbers and such. The fact that these deliveries are happening in this way, does that say to you the law is not working?
No, what it says to me is that the law is working, but we have to remember what the Andrew Act does. The Andrew Act protects judges, federal judges, and shields their personally identifiable information on federal websites. The problem we have right now is many states have not enacted state laws that would serve as belt and suspenders to the federal law. So a lot of this information is accessible on state websites.
It is the most expansive presidential immunity doctrine ever established by any American court. This is the ruling that legal experts from across the spectrum have described as the most consequential expansion of presidential legal protection in American constitutional history. And this specific expansion is exactly what the headlines should be focusing on, not imagined rulings that somehow force Trump's resignation, but the actual rulings that have fundamentally reshaped presidential accountability. The tariff ruling, the National Guard deployment limits, and the ballot disqualification ruling are the specific separate court decisions most directly affecting specific.
So what we need to do is have the states and the federal government coordinate so that we can shield the very information that is now that the bad actors are utilizing to inflict psychological warfare on judges.
You know, there are some who will look at this and say, how threatening is it to have a pizza show up at your door? Why is that considered a threat and not a prank? What would you say to that?
I would say to those people that this is not a prank. This is certain bad actors that you send a pizza to a judge. It says, we know where you live. You send a pizza to a judge's child. You're saying to that judge, we know where your child lives. You send a pizza to a judge or that judge's child in my murdered son's name, and it says, do you want to end up like Daniel Anderl? Do you want to end up like Judge Salas? Those are acts of intimidation. This is a concerted effort by
pieces of the Trump agenda in ways that range from significant policy defeats to significant political wins. But none of them requires his resignation, and none of them seals his fate in the specific legal sense that the most dramatically immediate reading of the seal's fate forever framing most urgently implies. The paradox that we need to sit with is that the real accountability story is actually more alarming than any single fate-sealing narrative could capture. The same court that struck down his tariff program and blocked his National Guard domestic deployment also gave him the most expansive criminal immunity in American presidential legal history and kept him on all state ballots by ruling that only Congress can enforce the 14th Amendment's insurrection disqualification.
Today's other headlines. The Supreme Court has blocked the Trump administration from deploying National Guard troops to Chicago for now, while a legal challenge moves forward. It leaves in place a lower court ruling that barred the deployment and marks a rare setback for President Trump. The court's conservative majority has frequently sided with the administration on previous tests of presidential power. Trump has utilized the Guard in Chicago and in other Democrat-led cities to protect ICE agents and federal buildings over the objections of state and local officials. The U.S. military struck another boat that it said was smuggling drugs, killing one person on board. The latest strike, which occurred yesterday in the Eastern Pacific, is now the 29th known boat strike carried out since the fall. At least 105 people have been killed. As with previous strikes, the Pentagon provided no evidence that the vessel was carrying drugs. The Trump administration has said these strikes are part of a push to pressure Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. That pressure campaign has also included the seizure by U.S. forces of several oil tankers in the Caribbean Sea.
That paradox is as alarming in its constitutional implications as any single fate-sealing ruling the most dramatic framing could imagine. When Trump went on national television and launched his blistering attack on the Supreme Court justices, calling them fools and lapdogs, he was responding primarily to the tariff ruling that struck down his global emergency tariff program. This is the specific, real Supreme Court defeat, most directly grounding the seal's fate framing in something documented and consequential. The tariff ruling is a devastating policy defeat. The specific, irreversible constitutional determination that the emergency powers law does not authorize comprehensive tariff setting.
Turning to Ukraine, officials there say more than 600 Russian drones and dozens of missiles bombarded the country, killing at least 3 people, including a child. The strikes also hit the power grids of more than a dozen regions, triggering widespread outages amid freezing winter temperatures. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky took to social media, saying this barrage in the middle of peace negotiations was a, quote, clear signal of Russian priorities. He added, Putin still cannot accept that he must stop killing, and that means the world is not putting enough pressure on Russia. Now is the time to respond. The U.S. economy grew this summer at its fastest pace in 2 years. New GDP data, which got delayed due to the government shutdown, showed that a rise in consumer spending helped to drive 4.3% economic growth from July to September. That's an acceleration from the previous quarter. Some economists expect GDP growth to slow in the fourth quarter because of that record government shutdown.
And that Congress must clearly approve such major economic moves represents a fundamental check on executive power that the administration cannot overcome. The fate that is sealed is the fate of unilateral tariff authority as the primary trade policy instrument. That specific policy fate is as permanently sealed as a constitutional determination can make it. The National Guard domestic deployment blocking is another significant court ruling that is added to the accumulated accountability record. The court held that the legal conditions for Trump's attempt to federalize the National Guard for domestic law enforcement in Chicago were not met, reaffirming the specific limits on domestic military deployment, including posse comitatus. This is the specific, most directly constitutionally significant second policy defeat in the accumulated court accountability record, and the one most urgently establishing why the seal's fate forever framing is reaching towards something real and consequential. The constitutional limits dimension matters even when the specific constitutional determination most directly seals the fate of the specific deployment approach rather than the fate of the presidency. The ballot disqualification ruling is the specific Supreme Court decision most directly relevant to understanding why the seal's fate forever framing requires the specific most honest inversion of its most immediately alarming reading. The court's specific determination that only Congress, not states, can enforce the 14th Amendment's insurrection disqualification to remove candidates from state ballots kept Trump on all state ballots by removing the most immediately available mechanism for state-level accountability. Legal analysts described it as a significant political win for Trump. The specific judicial determination that prevented the most immediately threatening accountability mechanism from producing the accountability consequence most directly available through state enforcement. Now let me explain why the specific immunity expansion is more alarming in its accountability implications than any specific policy defeat the court has simultaneously delivered. You have to understand what the specific immunity ruling most directly established and why the specific constitutional protection it erected is as consequential for the accountability questions most urgently relevant to Trump's most serious exposure. The Trump versus United States absolute immunity for core constitutional powers is the specific most fundamental layer of the doctrine, the specific constitutional determination that the exercise of the most foundational presidential authorities, including using the Justice Department for specific purposes, is absolutely protected from criminal prosecution, regardless of the specific conduct. The presumptive immunity for all other official acts is the specific second layer, covering every official act whose prosecution requires the specific prosecutorial, showing that the immunity does not apply because the conduct is attributable to private rather than official capacity. Those two layers together constitute the most powerful criminal legal shield ever formally erected around any American president in the documented history of the presidential accountability framework. The application of this immunity doctrine to Trump's most serious exposure is profoundly consequential. The specific exercises of presidential authority whose consequences are the most alarming available applications of the most powerful available presidential tools, including using the Justice Department for personal ends, are now formally protected from criminal accountability. The absolute immunity for core constitutional powers means that entire categories of conduct that would have been prosecutable before this ruling are now entirely off limits to prosecutors. The presumptive immunity for other official acts means that prosecutors must overcome a significant legal hurdle by demonstrating that the specific conduct is attributable to private rather than official capacity, a distinction that is notoriously difficult to establish in practice. The tariff ruling, by contrast, constrains the most consequential available unilateral economic policy tool, the specific mechanism enabling the most ambitious trade policy agenda. The court's determination that Congress must clearly approve such major economic moves forecloses the specific unilateral authority the administration had been using. The president who is most protected from criminal accountability for his official conduct is simultaneously the president whose most important unilateral trade policy tool has been constitutionally foreclosed by the same court with substantially overlapping majorities. This simultaneous maximum criminal protection and specific policy tool foreclosure is the paradox that is as alarming in its constitutional implications as any single fate-sealing framing can describe. The specific immediate action demanded by each ruling determines the real-world implications for the accountability question. The immunity ruling demanded specific action from federal and state prosecutors seeking to prosecute Trump for official conduct, requiring them to demonstrate that specific conduct is private rather than official before the immunity protection can be overcome. That prosecutorial burden is the most consequential immediately demanded action whose difficulty determines how effective the immunity protection is in practice for the categories of conduct most urgently relevant to Trump's most serious criminal exposure. The tariff ruling demanded specific action from the administration seeking to maintain the tariff policy, requiring it to either pursue congressional authorization or accept the policy limitations the constitutional determination imposes. The National Guard deployment ruling's constitutional accountability dimension is worth examining for what the specific constitutional principle most directly establishes. Posse comitatus is the most fundamental constitutional and statutory limit on the use of military forces in domestic law enforcement contexts. The court's reaffirmation of those limits in the Chicago deployment context is the most direct available judicial enforcement of the constitutional constraint urgently relevant to the most alarming available application of military force in the domestic political context. The constitutional accountability action extends beyond the block deployment to establish precedent governing every future domestic military deployment attempt. The ballot disqualification ruling's political accountability significance is that the court's determination that only Congress can enforce the 14th Amendment's insurrection disqualification determines the unavailability of state-level accountability mechanisms. The 14th Amendment's provision is directly relevant to whether conduct characterized as insurrection disqualifies the implicated person from political office. The court's determination that only Congress can enforce that provision at the state level prevents the most urgently available state-level enforcement mechanism from being deployed in the most threatening available accountability application. The political rather than legal resignation dynamic deserves careful examination because it's the most important accountability distinction requiring honest engagement in content using the resignation inevitable seals fate forever framing. Courts do not legally require presidential resignation. The constitutional removal mechanisms available for forced presidential departure are impeachment, conviction, and the 25th Amendment, neither of which is triggered automatically by any judicial ruling, regardless of how catastrophic that ruling is for the specific policy agenda affected. The political calls for resignation intensified by court defeats are real and as alarming as the most dramatic political accountability framing can describe. But they are political calls, not legal commands. The distinction between political and legal accountability mechanisms is the most important accuracy distinction, whose honest engagement enables content creators to deliver both the dramatic accountability energy the framing is reaching toward and the constitutional education required for honestly grounded understanding. The commentator argument that repeated court defeats plus crushing lower court rulings can intensify political calls for resignation is the specific most important accountability accuracy distinction requiring honest engagement. Political pressure for resignation is real and consequential. The specific political dynamic generated by accumulated court defeats impacts the political coalition supporting continued presidential tenure. It is the most consequential political accountability mechanism available outside formal constitutional removal processes. But political pressure is not legal command, and the distinction between political and legal accountability mechanisms is the most important accuracy distinction whose honest engagement enables the most credibly positioned content to deliver both the dramatic political accountability energy and the constitutional education required for completely grounded understanding. The accumulated court defeats have created a political environment where calls for resignation are intensifying from multiple directions. The tariff ruling, the National Guard limits, the ballot protection decision, and the immunity ruling all contribute to a comprehensive accountability picture. The policy defeats represent significant constraints on executive power that the administration cannot overcome. The immunity ruling represents a significant expansion of presidential protection that fundamentally alters the accountability landscape. The combination creates a constitutional paradox that is more alarming than any single direction narrative can capture. Let me walk you through the full picture of what the Supreme Court's mixed Trump-era decisions mean for the overall accountability story. The most fundamental thing to understand is the specific paradox most urgently requiring honest engagement. The same court, in substantially overlapping terms, simultaneously expanded the most important legal shield against criminal prosecution and constrained specific policy tools in ways that create the most dramatic possible range of outcomes. This simultaneous expansion and contraction is the constitutional accountability story most urgently requiring the honest map that the most dramatic single-direction framing prevents by collapsing the paradox into the most immediately alarming alarming single-direction narrative. The immunity ruling's paradoxical relationship to the tariff ruling reveals the most alarming constitutional contradiction at the heart of the court's Trump-era decisions. The immunity ruling protects Trump from criminal prosecution for the most consequential categories of official conduct. The tariff ruling constrains the most consequential unilateral economic policy tool. The president, who is most protected from criminal accountability, is simultaneously the president whose most important unilateral trade policy tool has been foreclosed. This specific simultaneous maximum criminal protection and policy tool foreclosure is the most accurately alarming description of the court's simultaneous moves in both directions. The ballot protection decision adds another layer to the paradox. The court that struck down tariffs and blocked National Guard deployment also prevented state-level insurrection disqualification from removing Trump from ballots. Each ruling addresses a specific accountability question in the specific domain most urgently relevant to the accountability concern it resolves. The full map of all of them together, the immunity expansion, the tariff defeat, the National Guard limits, the ballot protection, and the election subversion remand, is the most completely described and most alarming constitutional accountability landscape in the Trump-era court record. The specific content opportunity that the resignation inevitable seals fate forever Supreme Court framing creates for honest and consequential accountability content is significant. The court has delivered rulings whose combined policy impact is as alarming for specific agenda elements as the seal's fate framing describes. The immunity expansion is the honest flip most urgently required. The court's actual most consequential fate sealing ruling most precisely moved in the protection direction rather than the resignation direction. The paradox of simultaneous constraint and protection is the most alarming available honest description of the full court accountability landscape. The most credibly grounded accountability story that the most dramatically alarming framing creates the opportunity to tell is about the accumulated Supreme Court decisions affecting the most consequential dimensions of Trump's constitutional position: the tariff defeat, the National Guard limits, the election subversion case remand, and the ballot protection decision compressed into the most immediately alarming single fate, sealing resignation, inevitable form. The specific fate sealed by the tariff ruling is the fate of tariff authority. The specific fate sealed by the immunity ruling in the most precisely opposite direction is the fate of the most serious available criminal prosecution for the most consequential official conduct categories. The resignation is the political trajectory intensified by accumulated policy defeats, and the legal command that resignation is inevitable is the dramatic compression whose absence from the formal legal consequences of any specific Supreme Court ruling is the most urgently required honest qualification. The accountability story that the resignation inevitable seals fate forever framing most urgently creates the opportunity to tell is the story of the most paradoxical constitutional accountability landscape in the modern American presidential record. A court that sealed the fate of tariff authority while simultaneously sealing the fate of the most serious available criminal prosecution approach, that blocked the National Guard deployment while simultaneously keeping Trump on all state ballots. And that set the election subversion case back for official versus private conduct determinations, while simultaneously establishing the most expansive presidential immunity doctrine in American legal history. Each specific element of that paradox is as alarming as the most dramatic framing can describe in a specific domain. The combined constitutional landscape is more alarming in its full paradoxical implications than any single seal's fate framing can describe. The resignation dynamics are real. The political pressure intensified by accumulated court defeats is genuine and consequential. The specific policy defeats are permanent and as devastating as the court's most alarming accountability actions can produce in their specific domains. But the most consequential single Supreme Court ruling most directly relevant to Trump's fate is the immunity ruling whose most alarming accountability direction is the expansion of protection rather than the sealing of any fate whose most alarming consequence is resignation. The most credibly positioned and most honestly grounded content using the seal's fate hook is the content that says all of that most clearly, delivering the honest nuanced flip that reveals the court's actual most consequential fate-sealing ruling in its most precisely inverted accountability direction, while explaining the paradox that makes the full court accountability landscape more alarming than any single-direction narrative can describe. The specific impeachment papers rushing in as Trump insults the Supreme Court on national television represent a political response to the judicial crisis that has been building for years. Members of Congress from both parties are expressing outrage at Trump's unprecedented attack on the judicial branch. The impeachment articles being drafted focus on Trump's violations of the separation of powers and his attempts to undermine the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. The specific constitutional violations alleged include Trump's public threats to ignore court rulings, his attacks on the integrity of individual justices, and his broader pattern of contempt for the judicial branch. The constitutional crisis has reached a point where the traditional mechanisms of accountability are being tested in ways they have never been tested before. The separation of powers, the rule of law, and the independence of the judiciary are all under direct assault from the executive branch. The impeachment process is the primary constitutional mechanism designed to address such executive branch violations, but it operates on a legislative timeline that may be incompatible with the urgency of the current crisis. The 25th Amendment provides an emergency mechanism, but it requires the Vice President and Cabinet to act. The specific political question is whether the accumulated court defeats and the escalating constitutional crisis will produce the political conditions necessary for formal accountability. The over 200-member baseline of members who have called for removal across multiple crises suggests that sustained institutional conviction exists. The question is whether that conviction can be converted into the institutional arithmetic required for impeachment conviction or 25th Amendment invocation. The specific constitutional accountability landscape that the Supreme Court has created through its mixed decisions is more complex and more alarming than any single-direction narrative can capture. We must honestly engage with the full paradox of what the court has done. The same institution that has expanded presidential criminal immunity to unprecedented levels has also constrained specific presidential policy tools in ways that create real accountability consequences. This paradox represents a fundamental tension in the court's approach to presidential power that has profound implications for the constitutional order. The immunity ruling's protection of core constitutional powers from criminal prosecution is the most consequential legal shield ever erected around any president. The absolute immunity for using the Justice Department for military decisions and for other core presidential functions means that entire categories of presidential conduct are now entirely beyond the reach of criminal prosecution. The presumptive immunity for all other official acts creates a significant barrier that prosecutors must overcome. This is not a minor doctrinal shift. It is a fundamental restructuring of presidential accountability that will affect every future presidency. The tariff ruling's limitation of unilateral executive power represents a significant check on executive authority that has been enthusiastically embraced by those concerned about the growth of presidential power. The court's determination that Congress must clearly approve major economic policy moves reaffirms the constitutional design that gives the legislative branch primary authority over trade and economic policy. But this check on executive authority exists alongside the unprecedented expansion of executive protection from criminal accountability. The combination creates a constitutional landscape that is deeply concerning from multiple perspectives. The National Guard deployment ruling's reaffirmation of posse comitatus limits represents another significant constraint on executive authority. The court's determination that the legal conditions for federalizing the National Guard for domestic law enforcement were not met reinforces the constitutional principle that military forces should not be used for domestic policing, except under the most extreme circumstances. This is a significant protection against the militarization of domestic law enforcement. But again, it exists alongside the expanded protection against criminal accountability. The ballot disqualification ruling's determination that only Congress can enforce the 14th Amendment's insurrection disqualification creates significant barriers to state-level accountability. The court's interpretation of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment effectively removed the most immediately available mechanism for disqualifying insurrectionists from state ballots. This has been characterized as a significant political win for Trump, but it also represents a constitutional interpretation legislation that may have broader implications for how other constitutional provisions are enforced at the state level. The election subversion case remand adds another layer to this complex constitutional picture. The court's determination that the specific charges must be evaluated based on the official versus private conduct distinction creates additional barriers to prosecution. The remand requires lower courts to conduct detailed analysis of which specific conduct is attributable to official capacity and which to private capacity. This analysis will be time-consuming, fact-intensive, and may ultimately result in the dismissal of many of the charges. The combined impact of these rulings is a constitutional accountability landscape that is simultaneously more protective of presidential power and more constraining of specific presidential policy tools. This is the paradox that honest content must engage with. The president who is most protected from criminal prosecution for official conduct is also the president whose most important unilateral policy tools have been constitutionally foreclosed. This combination of maximum protection and maximum constraint creates a constitutional situation that is genuinely alarming. The specific impeachment papers rushing in as Trump insults the Supreme Court on national television are the immediate political response to this constitutional crisis. The articles of impeachment being drafted focus on Trump's violations of the separation of powers, his attacks on judicial independence, and his attempts to undermine the constitutional order. The specific allegations include Trump's public statements calling the justices fools and lapdogs, his threats to ignore court rulings, and his broader pattern of undermining the legitimacy of judicial review. The constitutional basis for impeachment in this context is Trump's violation of his oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. By attacking the Supreme Court and threatening to ignore its rulings, Trump is directly undermining the constitutional structure that the oath requires him to uphold. The specific conduct alleged in the impeachment articles is a pattern of behavior that demonstrates a fundamental disregard for the constitutional separation of powers. The political calculus surrounding the impeachment effort is complex. The accumulated court defeats have intensified political calls for resignation from multiple directions. The tariff ruling, the National Guard limits, and the ballot protection decision have all contributed to a political environment where Trump's continued tenure is increasingly difficult to justify. The immunity ruling has paradoxically created additional political pressure by demonstrating that the court is willing to protect presidential power even as other elements of the judiciary impose significant constraints. The specific question facing members of Congress is whether the accumulated conduct and the court defeats together constitute grounds for impeachment. The high crimes and misdemeanors standard is fundamentally a legislative judgment about whether the president's conduct is so serious that removal is warranted. The pattern of conduct that includes attacks on the judiciary, threats to ignore court rulings, and broader efforts to undermine constitutional governance may constitute such grounds. The 25th Amendment track remains a separate constitutional mechanism that could potentially remove Trump more quickly than impeachment. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment requires the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet to transmit a declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. This mechanism operates on a timeline that is compatible with genuine emergencies, but it requires the Vice President and Cabinet to act, and there is no indication that they are willing to do so. The political conditions for removal have shifted significantly as a result of the accumulated court defeats and Trump's escalating attacks on the judiciary. The over 200-member baseline of members who have called for removal across multiple crises is now being supplemented by additional members who are joining the calls for accountability. The specific trigger of the Supreme Court insults has intensified the demands for action. The constitutional theory supporting impeachment in this context is that Trump's attacks on the judiciary and threats to ignore court rulings constitute a fundamental violation of his constitutional responsibilities. The separation of powers requires each branch to respect the independence of the other branches. By attacking the Supreme Court and threatening to ignore its rulings, Trump is violating this fundamental principle. The specific conduct alleged in the impeachment articles is a pattern of behavior that demonstrates a fundamental disregard for the constitutional order. The legal and political accountability dynamics are distinct but interrelated. The legal accountability mechanisms are impeachment and the 25th Amendment. The political accountability mechanisms are public pressure, election results, and calls for resignation. The court defeats have intensified the political accountability mechanisms, which in turn are increasing pressure for legal accountability mechanisms. The specific relationship between these different mechanisms is complex and evolving. The outcome of this constitutional crisis remains uncertain. The impeachment process is proceeding, but it is unclear whether the necessary votes exist for conviction. The 25th Amendment invocation is possible in theory, but politically improbable. The political calls for resignation are intensifying, but there is no indication that Trump is willing to resign. The constitutional order is being tested in ways that it has not been tested since the Civil War. The Supreme Court's most alarming ruling didn't constrain Trump. It expanded his immunity, shielding him from the most serious abuses. The paradox: policy defeats mount while presidential protection grows. This isn't accountability, it's constitutional protectionism. And that's the real story.